I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and you probably heard the pre-conversation. This is an open forum. It's glasnost, whatever. We are so fortunate. This is our first, as we say, international Zoom author talk. We're again very fortunate, Professor Helen Yaffe, and I just want to say how it came about. I'm a big fan of hers. I've been reading Counterpunch for many years. Everybody check out Counterpunch. You can read previous articles, great political writing, and she's done a fabulous job in terms of Cuba. And the interesting thing is her book is published by Yale University Press, and we work at the New Haven Public Library, which is, you could actually throw a stone and you could hit Yale University Press. It's right there, so it's a strange fate. But anyways, thanks to Yale University Press, and thank you for writing the book. So I'd like to introduce Professor Helen Yaffe, who is lecturer in economic and social history, University of Glasgow in Scotland, and also a visiting fellow at London School of Economics and Political Science. In addition to We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, she's the author of Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, and co-author of Youth Activism in Solidarity, Nonstop Picket Against Apartheid. Professor Yaffe, thanks again. Really appreciate, and it should be an interesting discussion. For more people joining us, we have about 15 people so far. And I think at the end, we can open it up. I mean, if it doesn't get, again, as I said, to massive amounts, but so she'll share the screen and go through the presentation. Then we get into a good old New England style.
Shall I start now?
Sorry?
Shall I start? Or
yes, thank you so much, yeah.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So everyone, I'm going to share the screen because I have a presentation. I'd really appreciate if someone could just drop a note to say, or because you can't speak, to say that you can see that. I hope you can all see that.
Yeah, I think it's visible.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay.
Q&A.
Yep, good, thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
Great. So I decided that, first of all, I'll introduce a little bit about myself and why I wrote the book and how I ended up writing so much material about Cuba. And then I'll go through, and basically the book is so comprehensive with different themes. So I will essentially summarize all the different themes in the book. And feel free to, make a note of things that you would like to ask me about or comment on at the end. So that's absolutely fine. Okay, so my heart is in Havana. I lived in Cuba between 1995 and 96 when I was just 18 years old with my older sister and no parents. So that really captivated us, really sort of felt Cuba rather than just visiting it. It was a very difficult period. Any of you who know a bit about Cuba's recent history will know that that was the midst of what is known as the special period. The special period was the period of economic crisis that resulted with first the distancing of the Soviet Union from Cuba, and then the transition back to capitalism of the socialist bloc countries and the USSR. Cuba entered a very deep crisis. To put it in perspective, if you think about the kind of economic crisis we're experiencing now with COVID-19, the kind of falls in gross domestic product, within 2 to 3 years, Cuba saw a fall in its GDP of about 35%. So the kind of economic catastrophe associated with something like what we're going through now, but actually just resulted from the loss of 85 or 86% of its trade and investment. So I then got involved in doing solidarity brigades with Cuba, and RATB, short for Walk Around the Blockade, which was the group that I worked with of mainly young people taking sound systems and disco equipment out to young Cubans. So it was a great kind of exchange. And I returned, yearly for brigades. There was also international festivals then, as I started to focus on Cuba for my PhD. I returned for research and other events. And each time I left behind a growing network of family, friends, colleagues, and compañeros. So I mentioned my doctoral research that was on Che Guevara's work as the Minister of the Economy, Minister of Industries rather. He was also the President of the National Bank, and this was an area of Che's life that very little had been written about in English. So I went to find out what Che was doing for 6 years as a member of the Cuban government. And as Seth kindly mentioned, that was published as my first book, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, in 2009. Subsequently, continued to return to Cuba for my research for this book, We Are Cuba. You can see these two photos here. They're sort of iconic photos, which actually I took from the special period when 90% of Cuba's imports of oil had come from the Soviet Union. That basically dried up within a couple of years, and Cuba, a Caribbean country with no culture of cycling, they imported 1.2 million bicycles from China and fabricated another, made another 500,000 in Cuba. So you had this kind of typical picture of old families cycling around on bicycles. Okay, so what did I discover? Well, Cuba is a country of contradictions. I love this quote at the top. This is from Isabel Allende, who is was rather, when I interviewed her, the director of the Higher Institute of International Relations. She said to me, Cuba is a mystery, it is true, but you have to try and understand that mystery. For 60 years, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a poor country with world-leading human development indicators, a small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance. And we maybe want to talk about what Cuba's been doing with its brigades to treat patients with COVID-19 at this moment. It has a weak and dependent economy, which has survived the economic crisis and the United States blockade. It is always referred to as anachronistic, and yet it is also innovative, as we'll be able to talk about in terms of renewable energies and biotechnology. Formally, it is ostracized, and yet there are millions of ardent defenders of Cuba around the world. Despite meeting most of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba's development strategy is not upheld as an example. So we need to investigate that a little, and here I've put the development goals so you can see for yourself. So moving on to the first chapter, I wanted to locate Cuba's struggle in the broader context of what we can call the challenge of development. So what is the challenge of development in general terms for as a global problem is the question of how countries develop. Is it the operation of the free market or state action that is decisive? Where can developing countries get the capital they need to invest in domestic infrastructure and social welfare? This is particularly problematic for small economies with a limited capacity for domestic accumulation. How can foreign capital be obtained under conditions that do not obstruct such development or undermine sovereignty? How can international trade be used to produce a surplus in a global economy, which many argue tends towards unequal terms of trade? So for the Cubans, in setting out to answer the challenge of development, they first of all analysed what they thought was the cause of their underdevelopment. And that, for the Cubans, was US imperialism. They see that as the principal explanation for the island's structural weaknesses. Now, Edward Bolstein was an economist from the United States who went to Cuba in the very early years to help them with their transition to a planned economy. And he had experience actually from the United States and planning in the 1940s during the Second World War. He said in his excellent book on the economic transformation of Cuba, until the revolution, the central fact about the Cuban economy was its domination by American imperialism. And he goes through all the other manifestations and explains how they are products of that. So, because they identified this as the cause, Cubans then adopted a centrally planned economy and state ownership, because they saw that as the best answer to Cuba's historical development challenges. But of course, that doesn't mean that those problems are resolved just by the decision to go down a socialist development path. Among socialist countries, there were many different recommendations of how these objectives, socialist development, should be pursued. So they then had to tackle the question of what strategies are best to build socialism in a blockaded and trade-dependent island. Very different scenario from the Soviet Union, of course. Now, what we mentioned in my first book, what I was looking at then is how the debates that the work that Che Guevara did to develop a unique system of economic management, or the budgetary finance system, but debates that took place in the 1960s about this question of the best strategies to build socialism. Now, although there was a great debate, which Che Guevara led, the issues were never resolved, and they have been a recurring theme in Cuba, and understanding that helps us to understand why Cuba seems to adopt contrary economic management, flipping between the plan and the market. The chapter also focuses on a period from the mid-1980s known as rectification. The long term is rectification of errors and negative tendencies, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But what it shows that the Cuban leadership pulled Cuba away from the Soviet model from the 1980s and began to very much forge its own path. And in relation to Fidel Castro's role in rectification, there is a very apt quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian novelist, who said Fidel Castro is both the head of government and leader of the opposition, as Fidel led the criticism about the existing system, economic management system in Cuba, which was based on the Soviet model. Okay, so then we get to the crisis. Now, the fascinating thing is on the Moncada Day, 26th of July, 1989, which is 2.5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro came out with this statement. If we were to wake up and learn that the USSR had disintegrated, even under those circumstances, Cuba and the Cuban Revolution would continue struggling and resisting. The words created quite a shock for most Cubans who were not expecting that to happen. But the process began very quickly after with the transition back to capitalism of the Eastern European socialist countries. So here we have now, we entered the special period in response to that. In the special period we can describe as a sort of crisis management, but without military confrontation. And again, it actually began 16 months before the USSR fell. It's often associated with being something that starts after the Soviet bloc collapses, but actually it's in response to the Soviet Union saying that it would only trade with Cuba at market prices. And the special period was particularly acute throughout the 1990s and became an enduring feature of Cuban reality. And there's big debates about when it finished, or to the extent to which it has finished in Cuba. So I was in Cuba in this period, and I saw how Cubans dug deep to find what they needed to survive as individuals, but also as a socialist society. The chapter discusses the state of the Cuban economy in the 1990s, why it was so vulnerable to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. It discusses the immediate impact in terms of economy, health, society, how the society mobilized to deal with that, how the Communist Party mobilized its forces to deal with that. It discusses the economic reforms and restructuring process that was initiated. So Cuba completely restructured its economy for reinsertion into the global capitalist market. It had no alternative, but it's incredible that it did so so effectively. It also discusses the programs that they used to alleviate the social crisis. They had terrible malnutrition and so on. The emergence of inequality and illegality, partly as a response to the economic reforms, like introducing the dollar hard currency, changes to the agricultural system of ownership and production, particularly the shift to organic farming and urban farming, the introduction of sustainable development, the move towards that, but also this was a period of increased political participation and community mobilization. But the deep scars of the special period remained in Cuba and are still there today. So by the end of the 1990s, the Cuban economy has started to recover, and it puts the society in a position where it can reflect on where they are in the state of society. And this process takes place under the label the Battle of Ideas, and I've called this Fidel Castro's Citizens' Army. This starts really with the struggle to return the shipwrecked Cuban boy Elian Gonzalez to his father. Most of you will remember that, I'm sure. That was 1999, and in Cuba there was mobilization around that issue, but also the start of a critical evaluation to say, why would a mother risk the life of a child to travel on a raft across the ocean? And subsequently it grew into the Battle of Ideas, which catalyzed very ambitious socio-economic and education programs with youth as the principal protagonists and beneficiaries. So there were a whole section of the investigation started with just before the Elian Gonzalez case, with an investigation on the youth prisoners. Why were they in prison? What was their status? What was the situation of their parents, and so on. And then they started to look at young people who were outside education and outside training, and they were just hanging around. These youth were called in Cuba disconnected youth, and they were reincorporated into society through this Battle of Ideas as social workers who went to their own communities and worked with their neighbours and their own communities to find out what were the problems they faced, and to work with programs to try and meet their needs. This is a photo here of a group of social workers, and they, it's very noticeable that they are in the majority non-white and also female. Very important development. So this process is happening in Cuba in the face of escalating United States hostility from the US Bush administration. And so the Battle of Ideas has an ideological or political element as well, which is that it seeks to strengthen socialist consciousness while tackling the material deprivation on the island to alleviate the impact of austerity. And we see here an interesting shift from universal provision, which has always been the system in Cuba, to targeted provision, to working out what needs are and targeting scarce resources to meet those needs. The ultimate of these socio-economic programs was a survey that was carried out of the entire population under 15 years old, or 15 and under, an investigation of their biopsychosocial situation, and that involved 2 million Cuban children, and programs were enacted as a consequence to meet their needs. Okay, so now I move on, because it's sort of chronological as well, to look at something called the energy revolution. And I'll start with a quote from Luis Perez, who is the president of an NGO in Cuba called Cuba Solar, which promotes renewable energies. He said to me, "Energy is an instrument of power. What did the United States do when it broke off relations with Cuba? Take away our oil supply. What did the USSR do? Give us oil." So the energy revolution was a major state initiative from 2005 onwards to improve both energy security and energy efficiency. It involved the installation of new power generators in what's called a distributed system, so lots of little generators spread around the country, which is very good for security, but is also a step closer to shifting to renewable energies. There was an increased emphasis on renewable energies, a progressive electricity tariff, so again moving away from everything's free, heavily subsidized for everyone, so the more you use, the more you paid. The replacement of old durable goods with energy saving equipment. So this meant, for example, that Cuba, within 6 months of switching bulbs replacing old bulbs with energy bulbs. Cuba completed that switch, became the first country to do so in the world, but it did it within 6 months. Old refrigerators, televisions, sort of diesel guzzling equipment, that was all replaced with new equipment, and a lot of that came from China. There was one thing that really struck me when I did the research for this chapter was the fact that actually research into renewable technologies had begun in Cuba by the late 1960s. So there was the scientific and technical expertise, but what they hadn't had is the imperative to shift while they were receiving low-cost oil from Russia. So there are now major efforts underway to shift the energy mix towards renewable energies, and unfortunately the plans are far ahead of their capability, partly because the United States blockade is obstructing the finances that they need to in very costly investments. Okay, so then we move on to the curious case of Cuba's biotech revolution. This was the first time in its economic history that Cuba had incorporated itself into an emerging industrial sector. That was said to me, that was said to me by Dr. Agustin Laje, who is a very big key player in the story of the development of Cuban biotech. He was, when I interviewed him, the director of the Center for Molecular Immunology, which has developed the lung cancer vaccine, which is currently being researched, or trialed rather, by Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo. So the Cuban industry was initiated in 1981 with state investment. Remember that the United States blockade since the outset has included medicine and medical equipment. This is really early on. The first ever biotech company in the world was 1976 in the United States, the second in 1980. 1 year later, Cuba was already working in this area. So what's distinctive is it's founded entirely with state investment, entirely state-owned. Profit is not sought domestically. They prioritize cooperation over competition, and it's integrated into the state-funded public healthcare system and education system, driven by public health demand, as opposed to the capitalist biotech sector, which was initiated on the basis of speculative investments. Cuba now produces some 70% or almost 70% of the medicines consumed domestically. They have nearly 200 inventions and products marketed in 50 countries and partnerships with 9 countries in the global south. I'm happy to talk about the use of Cuba's interferon alpha-2b, which has proved to be very useful for treating COVID-19 patients, and some other new developments that they're working on now. But Cuba has many firsts, not just the lung cancer vaccine. It was the first in the world to develop a meningitis B vaccine, the first to work with this lung cancer immunotherapy, the first to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, the first to produce a human vaccine with a synthetic antigen. Okay, so moving on to Cuban medical internationalism. Some of you will know, or if you've read the articles in Counterpunch, that the Cubans have sent, I think it's now 3,000 epidemiological specialists around the world to treat patients with COVID-19 in 26 countries. But actually they are a drop in the ocean compared to all those that have gone before. This guy, Leonardo Fernandez, I think went to Italy, but previously, this is a quote from when he went to Liberia to deal with the Ebola epidemic. While I have strength and they accept me, he said, I will go where I'm needed. So revolutionary Cuba promotes the struggle against underdevelopment, neo-colonialism and imperialism. They view global poverty and poor health as a result of those exploitative conditions, structural conditions. The first time they sent medics overseas was 1 year after the revolution in 1960, after a terrible earthquake in Chile, and without even diplomatic relations with Chile. So by 2014, just before the COVID outbreak, over 400,000 Cuban medical professionals had worked overseas in 164 countries. John Kirk, who's a Canadian academic who's worked on this, calls this the world's best kept secret. By 2014, Cuban medical professionals overseas had carried out 1.2 billion consultations, attended 2.2 million births, and 8 million surgeries. So literally millions of people have had their lives improved or even saved by Cuban medics. Excuse me. And at the same time, so it's not just an outward movement, at the same time, tens of thousands of foreigners have gone to Cuba, either as patients or as students of medicine. So the biggest, in some ways, just incredible program of receiving patients was the Children of Chernobyl program, where a few years after the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine, the Cubans realized, they were told by the Ukrainians about how children were suffering from cancer, and they began to invite these children with their families to stay in Cuba and to get treatment, but also to, they were stayed at a beach resort and to have a break and some, being looked after, as well as the medical treatment. And this program lasted for 21 years. It began just before the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So for that whole period, the special period when I talked about how difficult circumstances were, the Cubans were still receiving tens of thousands of these children and their families from the Ukraine, some from Russia and Belarus as well. In the end, some 26,000 people came under this program to get treatment, mostly children. 24,000 of them were children. Another, in terms of training of students, you have the Latin American School of Medicine, which was set up in the late 1999, following the terrible hurricanes in Central America, to train medics from those countries, because Cuba has never tried to create a dependency on its own medical professionals, but actually promote public health. And I think the latest is that 28,000 medics have graduated from the Latin American School of Medicine, which now incorporates people from around the world, including nearly 200 from the United States. Okay, so obviously you can't write a book about Cuba without, writing about relations with the United States. So I've called this chapter Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. My accent is terrible. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I interviewed for this chapter someone called Josefina Vidal in Havana. She was the woman who led the Cuban team in negotiations with the Obama regime, the Obama government administration, which took place for a year and a half in secret before the rapprochement was announced and leading to the restoration of diplomatic relations. History has shown, she said, that pressure, preconditions and aggression do not work with Cuba. For 6 decades, Cuba has faced unrelenting aggression from US imperialism and its allies, and this has taken multiple forms: overt and covert military actions, sabotage and terrorism, the United States blockade, which blocks third parties' trade with Cuba. It's not just a bilateral issue. Pressure on regional and international governments to isolate and ostracize Cuba. There's also been programs to encourage the illegal and dangerous emigration from Cuba, including Operation Peter Pan in the early 1960s, which was concerned Cuban children. Many were sent unaccompanied to the United States. And since 2006, the Bush administration introduced the Cuban Medical Parole Program, which encouraged Cuban medics working overseas to defect, to leave their missions and basically claim residence in the United States. At the same time, the United States administration has obstructed legal migration from Cuba. And bear in mind that 1 in 3 Cubans have relatives in the United States. So there would naturally be a lot of a requirement of moving to and fro. So accompanying this has been lucrative funding for regime change programs. This has sort of stabilized around $20 million, which is approved by Congress every year. And with all this money sloshing around, there are, of course, many vested interests. And even after the rapprochement with the United States, these regime programs continued under Obama. They included things like, you know, trying to get people through hip hop and youth exchanges, of setting up workshops that were supposed to be about HIV, but were really part of these regime change programs. So becoming more creative and insidious. And these actually intensified from the 1990s to the present. So that's what this chapter discusses. Okay, next I move on to look at the sort of political economy, the economic reform situation, with a chapter on Raul Castro's reforms, socialist efficiency or capitalist opening. So this is an account of the reforms introduced under Raul Castro's mandate from 2007. It frames each of those measures in terms of the problems they were intended to address and the results attained. This is important because at every step of those reforms, the politicians and the bourgeois media would respond by applauding this as Raul Castro embracing capitalism in the market. But I try to explain what the real motivation was. And I also highlight that mass debates accompanied all of these reforms. What were they about? Well, they sought to improve efficiency and productivity within the socialist framework, but by opening a space for market mechanisms. And I'll go on to talk about some of the contradictions that created. I highlight the process of national and sectorial consultations, which was repeated throughout Raul Castro's decade as president, involving ordinary Cubans in shaping their own futures and securing legitimacy and acceptance for the changes underway. What you can see here is a group of young people reading the what they call the lineamientos, the guidelines for updating the economic and political, the economic and social system. These were issued in draft form to the entire population. Everyone had access to them, and then they were invited to forums to comment. And really, it's incredible that the evidence that it wasn't just a paper exercise, because what we can see is there was, I can't remember the exact figures, they're in the book, but something like 1.3 million concrete proposals made by members of the public, by Cuban citizens. And as a consequence of those, 68% of the guidelines were actually changed after those debates. Okay, so the post-2011 process of updating the economy, the lineamientos, introduced contradictions into Cuban socialism. It opened space for market exchanges, private accumulation, the emergence of exploitative, in Marxist terms, social relations. So when you have a private owner who is employing someone and they are not on equal terms and they're paying them, but they're keeping the wealth that is produced, then that is, in Marxist terms, an exploitative social relation. At the same time, Cuban social, so this process was being promoted. There was a slightly economistic tendency, and Cuban economists were very much encouraging this process. At the same time, there was a group of Cuban social scientists and others who were criticizing the economic reforms for their narrow focus on economic efficiency at, they said, the cost of social equity. So they demanded action to halt the growing inequality and marginalization that was resulting from these reforms. As a consequence, or as part of a set of consequences, non-state licenses were suspended. The institutional apparatus was strengthened for auditing, taxing, monitoring and restricting the expansion of private interests. And the state reinforced control over production, distribution, prices in order to protect the population. This has been increasingly necessary, as I'll go on and say, because of new measures by the Trump administration to create real hardships for Cubans once again. And that means resources are shrinking, and the state has stepped in to once again make sure that social justice is prioritised and there is a control over the distribution of scarce resources. So this process of reining in the market opening shows the long-standing tendency to reassert the centrality of social justice in the development process, even at the cost of growth. So often measures are taken and external commentators say, well, why have they done that? That doesn't help grow the economy, but that is not the priority. They don't want growth at the, if they're sacrificing social justice. Okay, so as I was finishing my manuscript, it became clear that I was going to have to add another chapter, because the Trump administration had, particularly since the beginning of 2019, really started to apply pressure on Cuba. And the question became, how will Cuba survive into the post-Trump period? And I've got a quote here from President Miguel Diaz-Canel: in the most difficult times, Fidel and Raúl always went to the people. So what we saw was a return to the kind of Cold War hostility under Trump. Between the beginning of Trump and the beginning of March, there were 191 measures taken by the US administration to squeeze the Cuban economy and to cut off, its access to finance and other things. So oil, food and equipment shortages emerged again. Foreign investors and trade partners were scared off. That was the objective. Cuban revenues were blocked, including for healthcare services. The question became whether Cuba was returning to a special period, and how would the revolutionary people survive into a post-Trump period. But because the state still has the apparatus, although it had decentralized a lot of things, the apparatus still exists to channel resources, and it remobilized those and increasing the control over distribution to protect the population from those scarcities. There was also an important rise in state salaries and other reforms that were really trying to search for domestic solutions to bolster domestic production and reduce the dependence on external trade, which is where the Trump administration was trying to make Cuba hurt. And of course, this was taking place under the new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. The interesting thing about him is that he is younger than the Cuban Revolution. He was born after the revolution and is entirely a product of it. And he has overseen, again, you can see from the picture, another process of mass consultation, this time for the new constitution, which was approved in early 2019. This is a street meeting here where everyone has access to the draft constitution and is given their input and their criticisms. Okay, so last couple of slides now, just some reflections of what I think I learned by writing the book about how Cuba survived, and I've got a number of bullet points to summarize. First of all, the centrally planned economy and state ownership is vitally important, with the political leadership by the Cuban Communist Party to direct development. The disposition to take Cuba on an independent path to defend national sovereignty and social justice. We could see that with rectification in particular. The revolutionary resilience of the Cuban people, the way they got through the special period. The importance of education and culture in inculcating a commitment to socialism, to resist imperialist offensive. The revolution's ability to rejuvenate its ranks and the composition of its vanguard, which we very much saw during the Battle of Ideas. The commitment to sustainable development and preparing for climate change, and I'm happy to talk more about that. This is a photo here of Cuban children who are learning about sustainable development. State investments in science and technology to foster endogenous solutions and innovation. The commitment to internationalism as part of the struggle against capitalism, imperialism and underdevelopment. a principled intransigence in defense of sovereignty and in the face of external, mainly US pressure. The drive for productivity and efficiency taking place within a socialist framework, and the socialist state retaining the mobilizing capacity to support people through economic crises. We can see that during the COVID-19 outbreak, the Bush administration has continued to press Cuba and to, you know, that affects us all, because one way that that's happened is to pressure countries not to accept Cuban healthcare professionals and so on. So this situation is very difficult for Cuba once again. And we're left to ask, what could the revolutionary people of Cuba achieve if they were left in peace? If they were finally given the chance to prosper and not just survive? And that's me, I've finished. Thank you.
What we'll do is we have 15 people. I'm going to give me a minute. I'm going to let everybody in and we can have a conversation. Let's see. I'm going to, sorry. I don't know why you can. Hold on a second. Okay. Okay, go. So everybody you can turn on your screen if you want. I think it's, let's see. Okay. Sorry, give me a second. So we've got, let's see, 1, 2. Sorry, give me a second. Does everybody want to turn on their screen or you want to keep it off? Because it's, Rafa, you have yours on. Okay.
Don't see how you turn it off. Turn
on your screen.
How do you do it?
Okay, hold on a second, Nancy. Wait a minute. Promoting you. Try that now. Let's see.
There should be a button in the bottom left corner next to the microphone.
You're now a panelist.
There.
Raf, how did you turn on your screen?
Here she is. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
Okay. So I know some people don't want to be seen. Okay. I mean, it's all right. What we can do is you can either send it by chat. Any questions? Okay. And let's see, what do we have? And
oh, Nancy.
let's see, who is here now? I was going to direct this to Art Perlow. Art's from New Haven. And Art, did you know Ed Bolstein? Did you want to? Can you hear?
I did not know him personally.
Okay.
I've read his books about Cuba and about Chile.
Right. Okay. Does anybody have any questions for discussion? You want to put in chat questions, or everything was answered? I mean,
I'd like to hear Helen speak a little bit about the cataract operations. When I got to Cuba in the special period, you know, all these people had been brought in for, I'm under the impression, for, you know, months at a time for these cataract operations. And they didn't come alone. They brought members of their family. I mean, it was this very elaborate sort of foreign policy is how I saw it at the time, which was, it seemed like the most utopian kind of thing at that moment. And I think it probably still happens, right? Could you talk about it a little bit?
Okay, Zeph, do you want me to go now, or are you going to see if anyone else has questions?
no, nobody yet. It's
Okay, so let me tell you how that program began. When the Cubans under the presidency of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and he started these social missions, and to carry them out, he needed the support of Cuban educators and healthcare workers. So this started with Cuban educators going into the barrios, the poor neighborhoods in Venezuela, to teach people to read and write with their Yo Si Puedo, Yes I Can program, a literacy program which Cuba has, which is very effective and is translated into many different languages. And what they found is that they couldn't teach many people to read and write because they had what's called easily reversible blindness, so cataract glaucoma, which can be fixed with a 5-minute surgery. So initially they began to take people. The Venezuelans paid for the aeroplanes and the fuel, and the Cubans, they'd fly people over to Havana, and they would get basically a 5-minute operation, which would change their lives because it would restore their sight. Subsequently, as I said, the Cubans never tried to make themselves indispensable. Instead, they try and promote public health. So they then trained Venezuelans and worked in Venezuela to set up the ophthalmological, I don't like that word, surgery in Venezuela. And then this spread when ALBA spread, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, which was this trade and cooperation pact with Cuba, Venezuela, extended to Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Honduras briefly before the coup removed it, and several Caribbean countries. And they extended this program, which was called Operación Milagro, Operation Miracle, to people all over those countries. And then they set up, you know, hospitals in Bolivia where they could treat Bolivian patients and so on and so forth. So there is a statistic in my book, but I think it's something like over 4 million people have had their eyesight restored through Operación Milagro, Operation Miracle. And it is incredible that nothing is said about it in the mainstream media. You know, nothing. So yeah, I think it was an incredible program. What happens with Cuba is they say, right, let's try and tackle this problem, and then another problem emerges, and then they try and work out how they can tackle that problem. But the Cubans got no financial recompense out of it or anything. It was just because of their commitment to global health.
Thank you.
okay. Let's see.
Come on, guys! It's 1 o'clock in the morning here. Make it worth my while. Ask questions. This is the bit I like better than the presentation.
Oh. Hi, Helen.
Ellie, hi.
No
Hi.
questions, just saying you made me very, very interested in learning more. I saw something about the biotech companies in Cuba. We were amazed on how advanced they are and how innovative and how ahead of the times they were a few years ago. So that makes me want to read more about, possibly I'll get your book.
Okay, great. Well, on the
right now.
yeah, well, and the New Haven Free Public Library's got a couple of copies, but you can also you can buy it from Yale, or if you can bear buying from Amazon, the Kindle edition is on offer. So I'll just put that out there. Are you in the US?
Yes, New York.
Okay.
You can tell
there's
Mount Kisco Public Library to buy a copy, or you buy one.
I want my own.
There's a question in the chat. Shall I answer that?
Okay, and then Art will go next. So the question in the chat was, what lessons do you think are most important for people in the U.S. to learn from Cuba? Okay.
Yes, well, this is a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, what can you say? You can say that if we take the example of the response to COVID-19, I saw an incredible graph today on, contaminations, and the US is up here and Cuba's down here. We have been told for decades that only the markets can produce efficient outcomes. But actually, profit-seeking markets are incapable of mobilizing the resources that are needed for this kind of public health issue and the socio-economic consequences of, unemployment and destitution that people are facing all around the world. So it's called into question the very meaning of the word efficiency. And actually, if you look at Cuba's socialist model, where you have a state mobilizing resources in the interests of social justice and to direct them towards social development, you can have the kind of outcomes which I described at the beginning of the talk represent major contradictions. A poor country with world-leading human development indicators. So I don't think it's possible to take sort of piecemeal lessons from Cuba, because there has been attempts. For example, there was some people in the UK who were really impressed with Cuba's healthcare system, and this guy was like from the Royal Society of Surgeons or something, and he was encouraging the government to introduce polyclinics, which is a medical service the Cubans have. It's halfway between your hospital and your family doctor. So it serves, they have them all over Cuba. They serve 20 to 40,000 people, each population. But people look at Cuba and they say, oh, but their health care is so outstanding and they spend so much less than the United States does. But you can't copy that model unless you're prepared to get rid of private health care, prepared to get rid of the insurance industry. That's where the money is going in the United States. So in terms of, lessons, I think if you want a society that works efficiently in terms of social efficiency, environmental efficiency, then you just have to move away from the market and look at an alternative development.
Art, you want to turn on your mic? We have a question from Art Perlow. I'm Art.
Hi. So can you comment on the representation of Afro-Cubans in government, in the professions, in all levels of Cuban society? And does Cuba produce statistics broken down by race on income, wealth, etc.? And if so, what are the trends?
Okay, let me preface what I'm going to say by saying this is not an area that I have researched very deeply. But what I can say is obviously Cuba was a slave society. Racism was very much institutionalized, and the legacy of racism remains in Cuba. Now, I'm not saying anything the Cubans aren't saying. If you look at Raul Castro's, you're asking about the representation of non-white people or black people in the highest levels of government. All you need to do is see the comments by Raul Castro during the 6th Party Congress and the 7th Party Congress, where he, in the first one, said, you know, this is not good enough. We don't have a representation at the top levels of government that reflects the demographics of the population. And then when this has improved 4 years later at the 7th Party Congress, says, you know, we've improved, but it's not good enough. So we have to keep tackling the legacy of institutionalized racism. Does racism exist from Cubans on an individual level? Yes, it does, because it has very deep roots, and there is a debate among Cubans about whether the revolution has done enough to tackle the very deep roots of that. But in Cuba, because you know, I'm sure you know this, but in 1912 there was a black uprising in Cuba. And subsequent to that, or before that and subsequent, the sort of revolutionary movements and movement for independence haven't been identified by race. And the Cuban sort of principle has been about promoting unity, Cubanidad. Now, there is a criticism from many Cubans. They say, well, we have an institution, a federation for women, because we recognize that women, you know, were discriminated and in a worse situation. So we promoted women's contribution to society and their role, their development through the Federation of Cuban Women. Why don't we have the equivalent for black people? And that is a debate that Cubans have. So, I mean, the other thing in this speech, Raul, I think, the same one I'm talking about from the 7th Party Congress, he criticizes the lack of visibility of black people on the main TV programs and stuff. So clearly this is an issue, but it is an issue that is being fought out in Cuba. And I'd just like to say that on the issue of, you know, the pulling down of statues, and Steph was saying that the Columbus statue got taken down today in New Haven. I shared on my Facebook page a statue that they have in Cuba, which is to honor those who led a slave rebellion, and including Carlota, who was a black woman who led a slave rebellion in, I think it was 1848, I'm not sure. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question adequately, but I prefaced it by saying this is not my area of expertise.
Here's a question in your area. So Tom Costa, he's asking, environmentally, how is Cuba doing now with organic farming, replanting forests, improved farming techniques, cleaning water supply, and preserving animal species from extinction? It's a big question.
Yeah, I'm working on a book chapter right now about Cuba's sustainable development, but also something called Tarea Vida, which is the name. Tarea Vida means life task, and it is the name that they've given for the state plan to confront climate change. And as far as I know, it is the only state plan in the world that is a long-term plan. And when I say long-term, this plan goes up to 100 years. So they have recognized, identified all of the problems and the weaknesses. They have identified the threats to Cuba, which are severe. By 2100, 122 coastal towns will be wiped out if predictions are correct on sea level rises. They will have a problem with water that will be particularly severe, because subterranean supplies of water will be suffer from salination as the sea enters, plus less downfall. They have really heavy rain and then longer droughts and so on. So I've been working on this recently, but just to rewind, in terms of organic farming, I mentioned, there's a lot more detail in the book, I mentioned the shift to organic farming in the early 1990s, which in a sense was imposed on Cuba because their imports of fertilizers literally dried up. But they had scientists who were already working on these matters and how to produce biofertilizers. And then they got the old campesinos, the old farmers who remembered how to work the land with burros, what do you call them? Like oxen. Yeah, what boys? So they got them to go round to every single cooperative to train, you know, the younger people on how you use these. They introduced crop rotation techniques, biofertilizers, and all this stuff. And so now I think the statistic is 85% of all Cuban agriculture is organic, and it is organic by law. It is illegal to use chemical fertilizers for city farms, urban farms, organiponicos, and the small percent which does use it is the sort of, it's the cash crops, so tobacco and a couple of other things that still use fertilizers. So they have done amazingly well. They're really world leading. In 2006, the World Wildlife Fund did an analysis and said Cuba was the only country in the world to be achieving sustainable development, which means improving the standard of living of its population whilst living within the carrying capacity of its ecosystem. And that was backed up recently by someone who produced a sustainable development index, which takes the human development index and calculates for ecological questions. And Cuba was ahead. It was the first best country in the world. The analysis looked at 1960 to 2015. So massive projects of reforestation. Zeph, you mentioned Reynaldo Funes Monzote, who wrote a marvelous book about the sort of environmental history of Cuba and showed how the development of the sugar industry had led to massive deforestation in Cuba. So an island that was believed to have been like 90% forest was down to about between 8 and 12% by the early 20th century. And the Cubans have worked hard, actually, since very early on to a reforestation program. And I think they are now up to about 33 or 35% of the island is covered in forest. So they're doing excellent with that. It's in the constitution. Since their first constitution the revolutionary government approved was 1976, and environmental protections were in the constitution. It was one of the first in the world to recognize the environment in a constitution. So I hope that's answered your question. Again, yeah.
Oh, someone asked about medicines, and they developed their own, but where does 30%, someone said 30%, does Cuba import medicines? What percentage is that, or how is that sector handled, I guess?
Yeah, they import medicines. I'm not entirely sure what the breakdown is for those medicines, but Cuba has trade with a lot of countries around the world. It's interesting because the US blockade, as I said, is extraterritorial. That means that they attempt to cut off trade and investment from third parties and third individuals and companies in other countries. And yet Cuba does trade with many countries around the world. So I don't know the specific answer of what proportion of medicines come from elsewhere.
How is it with UK trade with Cuba? How would you surmise that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there is UK trade. There is an organisation called Cuba Initiative, which was set up actually at the agreement of the Cuban government and the British government in the early 1990s to promote trade. But individuals who have tried to, trade with Cuba have found that the US blockade is an obstruction. One form that this takes is kind of indirect, and that is, for example, there was two Scottish guys who wanted to set up to invest in renewable energies in Cuba, but they needed financing. I think that's normal when businesses set up and they start a new project. They go to finance markets to get financing, and it took them years. In the end, they went to a corporation in China, to a bank in China, to get the funding that they needed, because they couldn't get it in Europe and they couldn't get it in the United States, because the US Treasury threatens these banks and individuals with fines, and in fact applies fines. Interestingly, the Obama administration, I can't remember the exact sum, I think it's in my book, but applied more fines on companies and individuals for dealing with Cuba than the previous Bush administration, which was considered to be more hostile. So yeah, there is from what I know, I mean, there's some exchange with Tate and Lyle in terms of Cuban sugar, but from what I know, most of the businesses in the UK doing deals with Cuba, it's to do with renewable energies and sustainable agriculture. I have to say that there is a law in Britain. There is a law that you can use from 1980, and there's a law from 1996, which makes it illegal for US courts or US companies to take measures against British individuals or British companies for trading with Cuba, i.e. under US law. But that law is not, it hasn't been tested. Yeah. So in a way, like all of the European countries have similar legislation. The EU has similar legislation. And yet, while OFAC from the United States, Office of Foreign Asset Controls, and the US Treasury avidly pursues its own laws trying to stop trade with Cuba, and it fines countries and companies, those countries, European countries, Britain, don't use their counter legislation to block that. And that's something that we've been calling for, because it's there. And yet all sorts of things, humanitarian projects, for example, there was a project by Cubans in Britain to raise money to buy a second-hand concert piano to send it to a music conservatory in Cuba, which hadn't had a new one for 30 years. And they organized a concert with the name Cuba, and it was with Eventbrite, and they sold some tickets on the door, and some had been sold through Eventbrite, and it was something like 350 quid. But Eventbrite then said, we can't give you the money because our bank won't allow us, because we will be fined under the US legislation. And that goes on a daily basis. And sometimes it's, there was the Cubans offered some medical services, I think maternal health in Algeria under a contract that was paid, and they couldn't get the payment for that reason, because it was going for a German bank which was threatened by OFAC.
So I guess Scotland's not exporting haggis, right?
I don't think, well, they might.
I don't know if you know haggis. It's
yeah, I know haggis. Yeah.
No, I'm saying for our folks in the U.S. Anyways, is it a popular dish in Scotland? I don't know. Is it the?
I've managed to avoid it so far.
Okay.
What's it made out of? It's pig's bladder or something.
Oh. I just want to comment. I was interested in one of the photos I saw of you and Albert Granados. That was very interesting. You'd met Chase, so because most of us have seen Motorcycle Diaries, but the role he's played he's so remarkable. I mean.
Yeah, no, that was lovely. I met some. I've been really privileged to meet some extraordinary characters who have contributed to history. And it's very strange to read about this guy, Alberto Granado, the Argentinian who was a friend of Che and traveled on the famous Motorcycle Diaries, and then to meet him in Havana. He has a crazy accent because he's originally Argentinian. He spent years in Venezuela and now he's in Cuba. So, but yeah, no, that was great. I also interviewed what's his name? He's known as Pombo, Harry Villegas, who fought with Che in the Congo and then in Bolivia, and was one of the only Cubans who managed to escape when Che was captured and then executed. Yeah, just some incredible people, but that most of that was for my first book on Che, so there's a plug for that.
I don't see anything in chat. Anybody, was there questions before, or we can
Yeah, I have a question.
sure,
Helen?
Justin, okay.
Yeah, on your first book, I was wondering, why did Che, if you know, why did Che choose Mandel instead of somebody more third worldist like Amin to, you know, back him up against Bettelheim in the unequal exchange debate?
Well, you're assuming that he chose him. So they had a debate which was carried out publicly, as not like in the daily paper, but it was open for people to contribute. And Mandel was engaged with the debates in Cuba. That he just wrote articles that he could contribute to. The articles were carried in the journals of different ministries. So, I mean, Che was incredibly open-minded. He went in the early 60s. You had Paul Sweezy, Leo Huberman, and these people from the New Left were in Cuba giving talks, and he went and listened and encouraged everyone to. But, you know, there was once a group of young Cuban workers went to see him as Minister of Industries, and they said to him, "Oh, Che, we're having this terrible time." They were from the UJC, the Union of Young Communists, right, which was set up for the revolution. We're having this terrible time with these young Trotskyists that we work with, and you know, we don't know what to do. And Che said, "Oh, have you read Trotsky?" And they were like, "No." He said, "I suggest you go and read Trotsky then you can go and debate with him."
Yeah.
And that's how he was. He was totally open-minded. You know, when he was caught in Bolivia, he had a book by Trotsky, a book by Lenin, a book by on Marx. You know.
And didn't he free some Trotskyists too from something or another, and that's shortly before he went missing and so on and so forth, all that lore?
I don't know. It sounds to me like that is the preamble to a conspiracy theory about why Che went missing. And incidentally, Cuba has just held a conference about Trotskyism. I don't know if you know that.
Interesting.
Because I just want to reflect, I mean, when I was studying in Soviet Union in 86, 87, with perestroika, and I think the discussion of Trotsky was, you know, coming out, and Cuban friends would say, we really never had this problem. It wasn't, you know, this openness so we could discuss it. I mean, I think going back to the 80s, I mean, Helen, maybe you could, you know, when people group everything together, Cuba, Soviet Union, I mean, there was certainly, you know, Cuban diplomats, they said, we never had to deal with Stalinism. We didn't have this issue, so don't, how we build socialism.
They had an issue with the PSP, which was the
Escalante?
Yeah, the Escalante. So the PSP was the Communist Party before the revolution. Partido Socialista Popular, so Popular Socialist Party, had changed its name. And they were sort of very pro-Soviet communists. And they entered an alliance with Fidel Raúl Che from the movement of the 26th of July, who'd already entered an alliance with the Revolutionary Student Movement in 1958, so in the months before the revolution triumphed. And there was a bit of a power struggle, and Escalante was accused of you know, machinations to try and put his own people in power and so on. And I mean, I have to say that after, from the interviews I did with people who worked close with Che, apparently in the very early period, Che would choose the PSP members over people from the movement of 26th of July because they had political knowledge and experience, which a lot of the movement of 26th of July, his fellow guerrillas, they were campesinos, they were from the countryside, they had very low levels of literacy, they didn't come to it as ready-made communists, yeah, and it was only after he saw the machinations and sectarianism from the PSP that he said, no, actually, the people in the movement for 26th of July, their laws to the revolution will educate them politically. And they did some amazing, they had amazing sort of campaign to politically and ideologically educate people in Marxism, Leninism. They had, for the rebel army soldiers, they had a journal which, Che wrote for often, and so did Vidal, explaining concepts of imperialism and national liberation and so on. I just want to tell you another story. So I mentioned the Great Debate, which was about which socialist management system was best for Cuba, and you had Che on one side and you had a group of people on the other, and Alberto Mora was an opponent of Che on the other side. He was a minister, I think, of the domestic economy or something. And he was removed from his post for some other reason. And Che invited him to work as an advisor for him, even though he was an ideological opponent. And Che's secretary said to me, I asked him why, if you disagree with him, why are you inviting him to work with you? And Che said to him, well, because either he's right or I'm right, but we will enrich our knowledge in the process of debate. So, this was not a person who was scared of debate or different views. He actively, engaged it and saw it as enriching the process of, understanding socialism. And it was his biggest criticism, in a way, of the Soviet Union, was not just that he thought they had taken the wrong path in terms of their economic management system and having a hybrid system and too many capitalist elements, but it was actually that the stifling of debate didn't allow that discussion to take place. So rectification was impossible. And that's the opposite in Cuba, I would say. I just want to point out that CC has put in the chat a link to a petition, which is a change.org petition, demanding, I know some of you are from Britain, but demanding that Britain collaborate with Cuba in terms of COVID-19, which will require them to actively oppose the US blockade. So if you could sign that and circulate that, that would be great.
This is coming out of Britain, this petition here?
Yes, it's
okay.
Coming out of the campaign that I mentioned at the beginning, Rock Around the Blockade. Any other comments, questions?
I know it's getting to be 1:30, and thank you so much. I have lots, but I'm going to hold back. And I just want to say, I want to thank everybody for coming, and to celebrate the July 26th movement, buy Helen's book, read it, because if we're stuck inside, if there's an upsurge, give it to your friends. You have a birthday, a bar mitzvah, anything. It's a great book. It's a great gift. People should read it, and I'm hoping other libraries and in the U.S. will have it in their collection, because I'm proud to say I think New Haven and Brooklyn Public, I might be wrong, but the two public libraries that have at the moment. So I think we have a big task to get it out there, and I'll see. But it's so good to have you, and thanks for staying up. And oh, wait a minute. Okay, so let's see. Oh, colleague. Okay, thanks. So no final thoughts.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me and for organising the event.
Thank you.
I was very happy to participate, and I know there's some people here from the UK, so thanks for staying up late. And thanks to everyone else who joined in. Lovely to see you, Nancy.
Same here.
Sorry I can't see you, Doris.
Oh, okay. So hopefully, yeah, and hopefully you, Helen, if you're ever in the States or New Haven, you have to.
Yeah, I'd love to come by and swing
It'd be
by.
wonderful. And then you could pop right into Yale University Press across.
Yeah, and I want to check out who you've, what statue has been put up to replace Columbus.
Right. Well, because we have a big Italian American population, so I said Antonio Gramsci, and I did suggest Che Guevara. I did suggest Ho Chi Minh. So I'm way off there, but I figure we'll come to some agreement. Something that it's an interesting debate going on. So I think it's a good start, and I'm glad the young people, the young people, I give them credit in terms of Black Lives Matters. I think they really initiated it, and I'm 62. I'm sort of, I'm not going to lead the revolution. They are. I'll just help out. And
I know it's a fascinating period to be living through, and there's a real sense of change, but also how we have to change. We've got no choice.
Absolutely, and they're leading it. So, okay.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Ciao.